What's up, everybody? I hope that George enjoys his theme song. So you want to get right to the core. So you want to know what it's all for. So you want to come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. So you want to get straight to the show. So you want to know what you need to know. You want to know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's podcast by George. Podcast by George. Want to know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George, the worldwide headquarters of Podcast by George. We're back on the air. I've got my Halloween stuff going here with my black and orange just to be a little festive, and we're coming down the home stretch. 2020, the election, of course, November 3rd, just next week. And I've got a friend of mine that's been out on the campaign trail. This guy has been all over it, not for months, but for years. As a matter of fact, Chris McGreal and I first met at a John Hickenlooper event, believe it or not, in Des Moines, Iowa. And Hickenlooper was there. People probably can't even remember him, maybe, but he's the guy from Colorado that gained national notoriety for drinking frack fluid. He was a big supporter of fracking, and he wanted to prove that it was safe because it was a big deal in his home state. And he was at a brew pub in Des Moines drinking beer that night, but he soon kind of stepped aside and disappeared. You know, I got to admit, folks, when I see people like Hickenlooper or a lot of these politicians that are running for president right now, they all talk about spanning this partisan divide, and I don't even know if you can call it a divide in our country. I mean, it is massive. It is huge. When they tell me they're going to span the partisan divide, the mental image that I get is, if folks are old enough to remember this, Evel Knievel jumping the Snake River Canyon, and it was on live television. It was a big deal. He jumped that motorcycle off the ledge and immediately fell, and I mean, it was just a huge disaster. It just can't happen. I don't know if it can be done. I think about FDR, the most successful Democratic politician in history. He didn't span a partisan divide. He beat their ass. They hated his guts till the day he died. That's how FDR got it done. And in my lifetime, believe it or not, the politician that's come closest to that is John Edwards, of all things, who went down in his own flaming ass disaster. But he said, basically, I'm not going to span a partisan divide. I'm not going to reach out. I'm not going to collaborate. He said, basically, I'm going to beat their ass just like I have in every courtroom that I've ever stood in. The same types of people. And I thought, that's my guy. That's who I want. Well, of course, that all went poof for obvious reasons. Well, let's get him in here before we get on too long. And for folks that don't know, Chris McGreal, he writes for the Guardian U.S. He's a former Guardian correspondent in Washington, Johannesburg, and Jerusalem. He's the author of American Overdose, the opioid tragedy in 3 acts. Now, we're going to talk mostly politics today. But Chris, welcome to a podcast by George, first of all, and give us a quick thumbnail update now on the Sacklers and this opioid situation that you may be one of, certainly, the world's foremost authorities on.
Hello, George. Good to be here again. Funnily enough, I was just in eastern Kentucky looking at this very issue because there's a coroner in a county, Rowan County, who posted on Facebook that his county hasn't had a single death from coronavirus, but that the number of deaths from opioid overdoses is 3 times higher this year than it was last year.
Wow.
And I'd heard that of other places too. In fact, I'd written a little bit about it in the past, but it's clear that partly because coronavirus has shut down so much, including rehab for a lot of people, so people who were in treatment weren't getting it any longer and were relapsing, but also because coronavirus is kind of recreating the conditions in which, or exacerbating the conditions, I should say, in which a lot of people are drawn into addiction. Unemployment, struggling to pay the rent, lockdown contributes to depression and despair. And so, there's absolutely no doubt that part of the collateral damage of coronavirus is a resurgence of opioid deaths, just as they were edging back, although, to be honest, they remained extremely high, and much higher in this country than any other country in the world.
Now, what about on the legal front? I follow it, when I see it. I saw where the Sacklers and those folks kind of pled out or something, and they took a bankruptcy, and they want you to believe that these people are in jail and going home broke. I got a feeling that's probably not the case. What's the latest on that?
So Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, which owns Purdue Pharma, the company reached a plea agreement with the Department of Justice, 3 criminal offenses, essentially paying $8 billion in fines and restitution. That will bankrupt the company because the company isn't really worth very much anymore, given that it was mostly just that one opioid drug, OxyContin, which had caused all the problems. And in any case, the company's already filed for bankruptcy. Now, part of that deal is that there, at least as things stand, is that there were no criminal prosecutions of individual executives responsible for making these decisions, including members of the Sackler family. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they can't happen down the road, but it's very interesting that the DOJ was prepared to come to an agreement that didn't actually hold any individuals responsible, and the company gets to agree to pay a fine and restitution that it can't possibly afford to pay. So that has to be approved by, that deal has to be approved by a bankruptcy judge who's dealing with the part of what he's dealing with, all the lawsuits against Purdue Pharma, of which there are thousands, I think 3,000 altogether now, over its actions. These are everything from individual whose families, families that have been blighted by opioids, through to cities and counties that are suing because of Purdue Pharma's criminal actions. So really, it's a step. It's Purdue Pharma. Purdue and members of the Sackler family, or their lawyers anyway, have long been pushing a line that OxyContin wasn't responsible. This is all exaggerated, and this guilty plea at least does one thing, which is lays that lie to rest, that OxyContin and Purdue Pharma and those members of the Sackler family that were involved in the direct management of that policy were responsible for this epidemic, the worst drug epidemic in American history. And so that's killed those attempts to deny and pass the buck and blame the people that became addicted. But it hasn't, it is not, this is not the end of the road. There's a long way to go in resolving bankruptcies and everything else about that, and criminal prosecutions.
And for folks that haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend get a copy of the American Overdose, Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts, Chris's book. I mean, he's a writer. I mean, this is not academic stuff. It's a real page turner. It's heartbreaking. It's shocking. And Chris, I don't know, based on what's transpired so far, do you feel justice has been served yet as far as this is concerned, or you just believe that it will be, it looks like, somewhere down the road because of all this legal action?
Well, I definitely don't think justice has been served, and I'm not confident that it will be. I think there's a lot of people out there, particularly those most directly impacted by this, who want to see individuals held to account. Because, one of the things that was shocking to me when I was researching the book, it's like drew me up rather than being shocking, I suppose I should say, is, I dealt with a lot of conservative guys in the FBI, the DEA, state policemen, prosecutors, and these weren't instinctively hostile to big business, but they all spoke about the drug companies, including Purdue Pharma, as cartels, as behaving like the Mexican cartels. And I remember the mayor of Huntington, West Virginia, said these executives, drug company executives, they're just drug dealers in Armani suits. And I think there's a real sense that the individuals who made these decisions and who got rich off them haven't been held to account. And it's worth bearing in mind with the Sackler family that they pulled probably $10 to $15 billion of profit to the family out of Purdue Pharma and the money made off OxyContin. So out of addiction and death, that family drew $10 to $15 billion. They're offering to pay $3 billion of that. So they're not going to come out very much poorer. Admittedly, a good chunk of that 10 to 15 billion probably went on taxes and various other things. But of course, they've spent lots of money attempting to reputation wash, to improve the reputation of the family by sponsoring, galleries and medical centres and all the rest, all in the Sacklers' name. So there was plenty of money to go around, and they've still got plenty of money. And I think a lot of the families would like to see the Sacklers also pay a personal price, a financial price, for the profits they've made from addiction and death.
Ain't that America? And whenever we talk, I'm always reminded of, and I tell folks that the great thing about Chris is, and this opioid epidemic is a good thing. We were in the midst of it. It's us. It's here in America. But a guy from the outside comes in, a guy from the UK comes in and takes a look at this, and his observations are keen. I tell people, if you want to really know what's going on about you, about your life, my God, don't look in the mirror. Don't ask your husband or wife. Don't go to your family and friends. Get a disinterested not a disinterested, but get a third party like Chris McGreal to come in, a trained observer, and giving him an account of what's going on. And it's also why I like to talk to Chris about U.S. politics. And I want to shift gears here now and get to the second half of our interview, really, which is the run-up here, a very short amount of time before this election. And Chris has been spending a lot of time in Ohio, a key state, a swing state, a very interesting circumstance. He's got a new headline out in The Guardian that says, many Midwest Democrats, and people in Iowa don't consider Ohio to be Midwest, but that's beside the point. To everybody else, we're all part of the Midwest. They stayed home in 2016. And the question is, will they turn out for Biden? And Chris, I put it to my show all the time. I show people this chart of the people that voted Democrat, the people that voted Republican in 2016, the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by no small margin, but the biggest block by far were people that didn't vote at all. Now, you've met a lot of those folks. You've been scouring the landscape there in Ohio, talking to them. Tell us about what they're saying, the people that didn't vote, or even some of the folks that were so exasperated with their plight, with their circumstances, that they took a chance on Trump in 2016, and whether or not all of that's going to happen again in 2020, or whether or not we're going to see something different.
I think there's a real mix in there. Amongst the people who didn't vote, there's a very large number who did vote for Obama a couple of times, and may have been traditional Democratic voters who really didn't like Hillary Clinton. I mean, that's just one of the factors in all of this, but it was an important factor. And they stayed home. And I think they, I heard constantly over the years from people who stayed home who regret it now. Many of them deeply regret it. But firstly, they thought she was going to win anyway, and they didn't want to vote for her. It didn't occur to them that Donald Trump could ever win. They were ambivalent about Trump. They thought he would be, they didn't think he was very bright, and they thought he would be a mediocre president. They didn't think he would be as bad as they see he has been. And I think a very large number of those people will be turning out. And I heard that long before Biden was even the candidate. I remember being in Iowa, but Ohio and other states as well, going to those primary events in Iowa, it being the first stop, so there were so many of them, and particularly going to the Bernie Sanders ones and asking people, did you vote for Hillary? Lots of people at the Bernie Sanders one said, no, I thought the Democratic leadership screwed over Bernie. I wasn't voting for Hillary. Will you vote this time? Significant numbers of people said, I'll vote for whoever it is. And I think that you see that across the board. There's a lot of regret amongst people. I think the other kind of couple of groups of people that didn't turn out, one is the young, who on the whole don't turn out. They turn out much lower numbers than older people. I've been struck particularly by events of this year, how many young people are now kind of mobilized, energized, engaged with politics. Partly that's the result of Black Lives Matters. Partly it's a result of they kind of concluded as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests. They've seen their power. They've seen the power of protest and that young people can have a voice. Up until they've looked around and just seen both parties led by aging millionaires and couldn't see how they could have any traction in politics. But the protests over George Floyd's killing, and then over issues around that, like bringing down statues that they don't like, about changing narratives, the influence they've had, they've seen that they can make a difference. And I think that's energized quite a lot of them to get involved in politics, to vote. And I've heard from quite a lot of young people in different places, but including Cleveland very recently, saying, I wouldn't have voted in normal circumstances, but I'm getting involved and voting this time. But there was another group in Cleveland, which is perhaps also interesting, which are those who just don't see any point. Cleveland is about half the population's African American, and in those parts of the inner city that are majority black, I think there's a significant part of that population that voted for Obama because he's black, and didn't really see that much change and don't see that the president makes much difference. And some of those people I spoke to have concluded that Trump really didn't make their life very much worse, and they don't see any point in voting for Biden, and they're probably going to stay home. They tend to be a bit older, middle-aged African-American males more than anybody.
Well, let me put that in context for people. I cite these statistics on my podcast again all the time. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck in this country. 63% can't afford a $500 emergency. 30 million Americans didn't have health care. We're involved in 7 wars around the globe, sending the underprivileged basically to fight our wars. $4 billion a month in Afghanistan. We don't even know who the hell we're shooting at, according to the Afghan papers published in the Washington Post. But maybe most notably, often gets overlooked, we have the largest prison population, corporate prison system in the world. And 70% of the population in those prisons, black and Latino. Don't forget that. And you think, how can these people not vote? How can they get disenfranchised? Well, those figures, folks, those statistics, that's not a result of Donald Trump. That was after 8 years of Barack Obama. That was the circumstance our country was in. And a lot of those people said, no mas, no mas. I'm not voting for Hillary Clinton, for God's sake. A return to the past that got us here. A lot of them said, I'm not going to vote for Trump. And a few of them said, maybe I'll take a chance and see what he can do. He's supposed to be an economic genius. He's a billionaire. Let's see what he can do with the economy. Well, their circumstances have not improved, as Chris just mentioned. And that's where we're at today. Chris, the one thing that you say there that really gives me hope is, and again, this is something I've been talking about, with Joe Biden getting elected, which I kind of think he's going to. It looks to me like he's going to. If he gets elected, he's got to change. I mean, he's got to change 40 years, almost 50 years, my God, of his legislative career on the books. He cannot do what he has done in the past. We cannot have the status quo go on any longer because of climate, if for no other reason, but many other reasons also. And it's the young people that you mentioned about, these people that have had some success now getting into the streets and they can see what they can accomplish. We need to keep that rolling. That's going to have to keep going. It's going to have to involve everyone, not just the young old gummers like me that carried signs. We're going to have to get back out there and do it again, I think, to get these things changed quickly enough and on a grand enough scale to do some good, because we got some serious issues in this country. You think that's a realistic possibility, that people just won't in this country say, phew, we got rid of Trump, and then just sit on their laurels? Do you think they're going to stay active?
So that's an interesting question. I'd say certainly from some of the younger voters, people in their 20s and 30s, I think one of the lessons that they took away from Obama is that they saw him as a very decent man, but they realized that when he was elected, everybody looked up to him to change things and waited for him to do that, waited for that leadership. Now, we all understand the issues that Obama ran into and all of that, but the reality was that at end of 8 years, far less had changed than people had hoped for. And I think one of the lessons that they've taken away from that is that it's no good looking to one man at the top to just lead the change while you sit around. And I've heard time and again, I heard it mostly in urban areas, I have to say. I heard it in Cleveland, I heard it in Detroit, I've heard it in other places, particularly, as I say, from younger voters, 20s and 30s, is that we don't intend to sit around and wait for Biden to take action. We are going to be telling him what we want to see. We are going to remain active. We're going to push for that change that we want to see. There is no great love for Biden, and there's no great confidence in him. He is the man he's a transitional president, I think, in their eyes, in many ways. Now, is that possible? in the face of, we know the corporate influence on Congress, we know how the power structure works. How much influence will they have? I don't know. I mean, quite a few of those younger voters are looking to Kamala Harris and expecting her to voice some of that, their expectations. Whether she will or not, again, remains to be seen. But they see her as there and a voice to be heard. But I certainly got the sense that they're not intending to step back. And some of them, interestingly, were running for local office for the first time. They are becoming engaged, which has the effect, albeit it's only local office, but it gives them a voice in their local Democratic Party, for instance. And once that happens, as we saw with the Republicans in the 80s, when the kind of right started to really take over through the school boards and all of the rest, that can have real impact over time. So certainly there's an awareness, shall we say that.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast here over the past couple of years. I want to continue to follow your writing and get you back on the show here as we move past this election. This is probably the last time we're going to talk now before November 3rd, certainly. And kind of as we end here, give us a summary, kind of maybe your remembrances or this is a hell of a trail. This is something, it's unprecedented in American history, what you've seen and observed and written about over the past many years here. How are you feeling about it right now?
It has, as you say, it's been an astonishing 4 years. And it was kind of an astonishing 3 years capped by an even more astonishing 4 years. Who would have predicted that 2020 would look like this, or the election would be, about what it's about, which is essentially a referendum on coronavirus in so many ways. None of us could have predicted that. None of us could really have predicted the way that after George Floyd's death, the protests would shift so much of debate in this country. So I think that it's been an incredible year. I have to say that at the beginning of the year, before all of this, I would have thought that Trump was in with a fighting chance to win, partly because of the economy. I mean, I'd met so many people, including, kind of ambivalent Democrats, who were still prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt, to excuse him everything because of the economy. And I think that what's happened to the economy, although they don't always blame him, they do attach it to his style of leadership and coronavirus. And I've watched that drop away. And I think it's hard now to see how he wins this election. One of the things that's been most striking to me driving around this year is I meet all kinds of voters. I've met those voters who voted for Trump and then abandoned him really quickly, were horrified by him. I met those voters who stuck with him. I met Republicans who wish they had better choices. But I was really struck by the one kind of voter I very rarely meet is the person who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and 4 years later so loves what Donald Trump has done that they're voting for him. And that means he's not really finding any new voters. And if he's not finding those new voters, I don't know how he overcomes what looks to be, a much greater enthusiasm by his opponents to turn out and vote this time. He needs new voters to overcome that surge in opposition votes. And I don't see where he finds that in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. But we will see.
Well, yeah, and the elephant in the room always is the Electoral College. Again, he is going to lose the popular vote he did in 2016. And if you look at this article that Chris just wrote, it's all about how that vote shifts in these very small segments of America to influence the Electoral College to see whether or not he gets back, gets another 4 years. And, man, if he does, I'm telling you, just based on the climate, based on what these climate scientists are saying, man, the calamitous is not a strong enough term. Chris, thanks again, as always, pal, for coming on a podcast by George.
My pleasure. Thanks, George.
That's Chris McGreal. He's the writer for The Guardian U.S. He's a former Guardian correspondent in Washington, Johannesburg, and Jerusalem. This guy's been all over the world. He's seen all kinds of situations. He's been in crises near and far, and if we're not in one now, we never will be. And you got to check out his writing in The Guardian, and also the book, American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. Man, pick up a copy of that because that saga continues. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. If you like podcasts by George, check us out. Get us on YouTube and Facebook and Spotify and the iHeartRadio app and all these places where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's all there is today, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.